Hey, Alex Williams of the New Stack here for Cloud Native Security Live. Our topic is continuing the evolution of DevSecOps. I'm joined today by some guests who really know the space very well. Rohit Gupta, Global Segment Leader for Security at Amazon Web Services. Cindy Blake, Security Advocate for GitLab. And Sean Molchandani, AWS Security Practice at Accenture. Thank you all for joining in. I'd like to pose my first question to Cindy. And I want to get into really looking at the roots of DevSecOps. In your view, what are the roots of that movement? How have we seen this form? What have been some of the milestones that really mark it for you and show it's moving overall in the industry?
Sure. Yeah, I think it started with, there was a NIST study several years back, I forget exactly when, that showed that it was cheaper to find and fix vulnerabilities very early in the life cycle, and actually quantified the impact of fixing vulnerabilities late in the life cycle. And I think that was kind of the first step where people started thinking about shifting left a bit. I think that Gene Kim's Phoenix Project, the book was, it was a good catalyst to get people thinking about what's possible. It's easy to think about the barriers, but that one really got you thinking along the lines of what is possible. And then DevOps in general is a much more collaborative approach. So when you think about shifting left, it really becomes an enabler or potential enabler. While you've got tools and automation that can come into play there as well. And so together you've got people, processes, and technology that really sort of align with the DevOps methodology. And I think that that is the impetus for this.
Sean, would you add anything to that about the roots of the DevSecOps movement?
No, I think Cindy stole the words out of my mouth when she said the Phoenix Project is definitely a good catalyst. I think it's interesting to see that we're in 2020, and I'm looking back, I'm amazed that it's been 10, 11 years, at least over a decade, since we've started seeing, especially from Silicon Valley, so many of the startups and now companies that are far larger, that were releasing 10, 11, 12 builds a day. That was unheard of, but the fact that they were able to do it, pull it off successfully, we're talking, all the way from the flickers of a decade ago to the way Twitter, Uber, and others have come along. The fact that they have sometimes upwards of 100 builds a day. And when you think about not just in production environments, but this really started as the dev in a development environment. How do you actually be more, not just agile, and I know that's a play on words, but how do you actually be leaner? How do you release faster? And in my own experience, working with clients for several years, going through the pains of having these massive, I would say absolutely massive libraries of code that you run through static code analysis. Sometimes in a vacuum, it takes 24, sometimes 48 hours for a run. And it's just too expensive to fix something when it has to go back all of the way. And in that very, I would say, a relatively waterfall process, right? And particularly in public or government environments where the risk, unless approvals were met of release, were either too high or simply it was a no-go. So some of these have definitely prompted and spurred that movement. The other, I would say, is, of course, a change or shift in infrastructure itself and the capabilities available to developers, to organizations, be it containers, serverless, and more.
Rohit, I would like to ask you about this movement to shift left and how you're seeing that affect the people, the processes, and the technologies that they use. And as well, I'd like to understand how AWS is helping enable these changes in the ways that people are working to enable DevSecOps overall.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. The way we see the customer journey evolving. You have customers that are moving literally millions of workloads to the cloud, and there is a very large scale migration in play right now. And people are using this opportunity to re-architect their applications. There is no point in just taking what you have and running it in the cloud. Yes, you can do that, and there are reasons for doing it. But by and large, the benefits of the cloud really come in when you take advantage of the serverless, the container architectures that you can now deploy in a meaningful way at scale. And of course, the speed that both my colleagues on the panel talked about, and that is so important to customers these days. And so we recognize that that movement is happening. Customers are moving to modern sort of models of deployment. As I mentioned, containers and serverless are two examples. But also to take benefit of the cloud, the elasticity that you get from it, and above all, the automation. So what we are finding is that some of the capabilities that we are being asked for to really help drive that security into the development lifecycle by building into the continuous integration frameworks. So we have done a lot of work around helping companies build faster, deploy faster, figure out problems faster, and really take remediation action faster. So it's really across the entire tool chain that customers are able to now get benefit through technologies that we have in our Code Star framework with code build, code deploy, with automation such as things like CloudFormation, and then third-party services like HashiCorp's Terraform that our customers are using in a very big way to actually deploy some of these workloads in an extremely agile manner.
So it sounds like what you're saying, Rohit, that security is, in some respects, acting as a catalyst for adoption. And it's through DevSecOps that we do see real changes in how people view the way that they think about modern application development. Cindy, my question for you is, how do you see security people getting more involved in these teams? How are they adapting to DevSecOps principles and practices?
Well, I think that the security folks have an opportunity here to focus more on policies and exceptions and a little bit less on tactical triaging. If you look at the traditional application security processes, it's because it's been at the end, kind of a waterfall method at the end. There's a big burden to track back and figure out, okay, we found these vulnerabilities. Now we got to figure out who do we go to get them remediated? Have they been remediated? Tracking the progress of that. And so if you can eliminate a lot of that back end work by finding and fixing the vulnerabilities in development, then it frees up security to focus more on thinking about what should the policies be, so that when we do that automation, the policies are automatically enforced, and helping with the exceptions. So if there's vulnerabilities that are found that maybe a developer isn't sure how to fix them, they could work together to to focus on the remediation, as opposed to spending some really precious security resources focusing on triaging and tracking.
Sean, you have a lot of experience in the security space. How do you reflect upon security's participation in DevSecOps and how they may further participate, especially considering that they are quite accustomed to being at the very end of the process, not all the way through the process itself of the application development practice?
So I'd say, yeah, it's almost been unfortunate at times about security sometimes getting a bad rep as the inhibitor versus a catalyst, right? Or security as a value creator, simply because it's been brought in at the end, in terms of, and it's always been a no. Versus in this case, it's a catalyst to, okay, we'd like to use containers, we'd like to use serverless. Sometimes the business wants to do that because it allows for faster go-to-market. And of course, it's very cost competitive, right? It reduces total cost of ownership, it minimizes debt. Specifically from a security perspective, I think we can and we are heavily engaged as Cindy mentioned, upfront in the design phase. I would say not only from a governance perspective, but what should a DevSecOps pipeline look at, right? And answering and architecting the question, the entire pipeline, the process upfront. When developers push to the cloud, for example, right? And let's say they push to a GitHub or a GitLab repo. Are there pre-commit hooks that are called that check for credentials? What are some of the functionality built into GitHub and GitHub itself that looks for secrets, for exposed keys? These are things we can make sure that developers aren't committing certain cases or aren't committing sensitive data. Once that information, say for example, or code makes it to AWS, let's say serverless on Lambda, looking at the different ways that you can actually safeguard those. Do you invoke automation to actually detect if there are secrets embedded in code there? How do you use some of the wonderful capabilities AWS has, such as Secrets Manager, to manage these effectively? How do you use third-party or open source capabilities such as, say, a shield, like Function Shield? That's something that was released by PureSec to safeguard Lambda functions. Or how do you use some of the config checks that AWS makes available to make sure that Lambdas or serverless functions are only running with certain roles, like certain execution roles? They have limited privileges. What should those be? Similarly, for containers, just wanted to share an example. AWS has ECS or Elastic Container Service with target mode as an example. It takes away the pain of not only maintaining the underlying server cluster or virtual machines that are hosting them and patching them and all of the other, you would say, ops, SecOps, if you will. But the role of security there is then defining up front and working with the architects saying, what does task networking for containers look like? What kind of tasks should these execute? Should they be allowed to have public connectivity or not? So these are some of the design decisions that made early from security help prevent, I would say, misconfigurations later on. And just one more thing, I mean, as we talk about multiple releases, not only every day, but every hour, there are so many of these container images, be it Docker images, others, where base images, I would say there are studies from mid last year, about 51% of all Docker containers or Docker images used out there are base images. And the top 10 images, say in some of these studies by Sneak and others, all ship with 30 plus vulnerabilities each. So how do you actually put in place a process that automatically revokes deployment of a new image or new container if it contains certain severity of vulnerabilities or they've been disclosed for a long time? There again, leveraging some of the cloud native capabilities like a scanner, built-in scanner within the AWS's Elastic Container Repository, the fact that these are turned on, the fact that these are utilized, that there's a process around it, and we can actually measure the impact of how successful these are, and monitoring comprehensively goes a long way. Again, as one last thing, as Cindy mentioned, it takes away the pain of remediation or having to discover things after the fact. If there are defects in configurations, if there are misconfigurations, if there are defects in code, the role of security then is to explain perhaps to developers and to educate, well, how can we prevent these? How can we remediate these right now? And also, how can we prevent these kinds of misconfigurations, deviations from process, or poorly written or insecure code going forward?
Excellent. Rohit, what would you add to this in terms of how customers are thinking about their own infrastructure and their application architectures? And they must have had to adapt over some period of time. And now I'm curious, what is it that they're looking for in terms of change for themselves?
I think above all, customers are looking to move fast, and yet stay secure. I think that it used to be that you had to do one or the other. If you move fast, you have to sort of leave security behind. If you were really worried about security, it just prevented you from going fast. And I think what we have seen is that desire where they're not willing to give up either thing. They want both. And so a lot of what we do is really give them better visibility and yet better control at the same time, achieve it really by automation. If you think about the way we deploy our own services, there is a large amount of automation that goes into our own deployments because of the scale we're operating at. There's just no other way to do it. And I think our customers are expecting to use the same sort of models that we use internally and are asking us for better, prescriptive guidance on how to actually infuse more security into their build processes, and then really to understand the telemetry that's coming out of the systems. I think that some of the technologies mentioned, for example, with serverless, how do you monitor a serverless infrastructure, and then how do you take action when you find issues? For a job that runs for a few seconds at best, there just isn't the traditional security sort of construct that applies, because to stand up a large security infrastructure in a serverless environment just does not make sense. It has to be something that can persist and yet act fast enough for a short running job, like a function or a serverless function might have, right? And so they're coming to us with those questions. And how do we secure this? How do we monitor it? How do we act fast when we find issues? Because invariably you are going to find issues. That is just, it's a moving target. The hackers have also figured out that the world has changed, and they are trying different techniques, some of which are not even well understood outside. And so companies are not just interested in doing the security work up front, but reacting fast, knowing that there will be issues that will happen. How quickly do I find out it happened, and how quickly can I resolve it so I don't get compromised in a big way? So that is really a big part of the change that we are seeing as well over the last few years.
Cindy, I'm curious from your perspective. We've talked about the roots of the DevSecOps movement, and thinking about today and the market that we're in, what are some of the ways that you're helping customers think about where to start, how to think about DevSecOps, and thinking about kind of the roots of the movement and how it can play out actually into people's own processes and workflows?
I think the real key is embedding security scanning into the CI process. So making it just a natural part of the CI process and delivering vulnerability information to the developer within their kind of native workflow and their tools. Developers love GitLab. We've got an industry-leading CI process. Security can draft on the coattails of that, and if you can use that as a lever to empower developers, you can really scale your application security program much more quickly. That's on the preventative side, but then there's also on the monitoring side, and finding things that are going on in production and new exploits and that area. We're actually ramping up some capabilities around that. We just launched some a web application firewall for Kubernetes Ingress, for instance, and we'll be adding some capabilities there, because there's lots of levers that you can pull in that environment. You've got your containers and your orchestrators and your cloud provider, and everybody provides security configurations and levers to pull. But for the developer and for the customer, it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I think one of the things that will happen over time is a way for customers to be able to define their policies and have that translated out to the individual elements in terms of configurations. And in the meantime, until that happens, I think misconfigurations has a good opportunity to be one of the biggest risks behind exploits for the next couple of years. I would put that along the same lines as patching. If you look at exploits and like the Verizon study and, those that have said where the biggest exploits came from, it was patching. I think misconfiguration is going to be a problem going forward until we can get a handle on it.
Yeah, Sean, I have actually interviewed people who have stated similar issues, in particular as it becomes a bit confusing about who actually does the configuration. You have this issue with developers thinking about configuration now, and the operations people thinking about configuration, and often it's a developer trying to figure this out in many ways. What are the pitfalls that you see with this issue, and how are you seeing customers prevent this from happening?
So in terms of, I think if I understood that, there's how do we, whose scope and whose responsibility does configuration fall under? And really what role does the developer
especially when you're
have?
looking at something like Kubernetes and cloud native security.
So there, right, I think there it's a couple of things, right? If we look at just containers, there's not just the type of container platform or the technology we want to utilize. For example, if you're utilizing containers, I mean, you could be having custom Kubernetes clusters on EC2 instances, or you could use EKS, ECS with Fargate. Understanding what the risk is in each case and having that defined up front, like what are some of the security controls that we need? For example, if you have EKS, do you allow pods to access the underlying EC2 metadata service? That's something that security professionals actively look for, and I think that's part of where they have to be in lockstep with a developer. Versus there's another example where a developer is responsible for configuration, in that when we think of cloud, infrastructure as code, and you're looking at CloudFormation or Terraform scripts, I mean, those spin up instances or resources themselves with certain configurations. And of course, CloudFormation and Terraform scripts are often written by developers. There we're looking at a whole different ball game of how do you actually incorporate securing or security reviews of those, as opposed to just conventional languages like Python and Ruby and anything else, whether it's for applications or it makes it into serverless. And there it's engaging with developers, looking at what are some of the pitfalls, and also the roles that developers have within the cloud ecosystem, wherein they can push these changes, and or who's authorized, for example, or who has the permissions to push new images to, say, a container repository versus the ability to launch them. So I think it's very much, if developers are provisioning infrastructure or making these configurations through code, it's the role of security professionals is both from an education and from a review perspective, also from ensuring that we set up some configuration drift mechanisms and understanding how we can monitor that and remediate, and then also, of course, educate developers over time in terms of what the best practices are and about the risks of misconfiguration and how their code directly has impacts in certain cases.
Great. Rohit, when I think about AWS, I think a lot about how it is become such a leader in the serverless space, and a lot about serverless is about that developer happiness. And we hear testimonials from people all the time about how they have become just so enamored with serverless because it has allowed them to be developers, and it has allowed them to move at a pace that they would never have thought was possible. And when you start having, these issues like, the concern about security across a vast software supply chain, how do you keep that developer happiness intact, but also paying attention to these crucial issues such as configuration management?
Yeah, so let's take the issue separately. Configuration management is a real concern, and I think that we have done a lot of work in trying to address some very basic things. So, for example, one of the challenges that used to be in the past was around open S3 buckets, where people would just have, they would make a bucket public, inadvertently in most cases, and then that would leak data, and there are many examples of when that happened. But now the default policy is it's not public, and you have to explicitly go in and turn it to be public. And so we recognize that customers may not always do things in their best interest because they just don't know, or they are moving so fast that they're not able to keep up with that. So we have tried to bring in capabilities to help them stay secure. We help them audit access. We help them look at the sort of broad infrastructure. We have Trusted Advisor that is a great tool for finding out the current state of my configuration. We have a new service we released at reInvent last year called IAM Access Analyzer that allows you to look at what can talk to what resources available to which instance. And so, for example, you can use it to say, okay, can this host talk to the internet? And that is a configuration or policy that you might want to change because you don't really need that to happen, right? So we are doing a lot of things to help with the configuration problem. And I think that over time, we believe that customers will use more and more of these capabilities to stay secure and prevent that configuration drift. As far as the question you asked around keeping developers happy with new modern application development techniques like containers and serverless.
Yeah, with security in mind.
There's a lot that is being done there as well with regards to better monitoring, better capabilities, but really also prescriptive guidance there and controls that are built into the framework. So if you use technologies and services like Fargate, where you actually push that onto us and we monitor and we secure it and we make sure that the customer application that's running inside that construct is getting the best capability that it can have, because we are able to bring that to the platform, right? And so turning over some of the traditional methods of monitoring and management to the provider, in our case, AWS, is one of the ways that we believe that developers will actually succeed in staying ahead of these threats.
Excellent. Cindy, I want to turn the question to you about dependencies and the issues that come with dependencies. And we see a lot of issues surfacing. We've seen, various vulnerabilities surface in Docker and NPM, and these are real issues that people face, and it does, I think, make it very frightening in many respects, for security teams. When you're thinking about these issues and you're thinking about DevSecOps, you have to think about APIs in many ways. And how are you, helping customers think more about how APIs are managed, and so they can be more secure, so to speak, in how they view their dependencies and how those dependencies are being managed?
Yeah, so on the dependencies, I participated in some CISO roundtables last year, and the CISOs are very concerned about the security of the dependencies, and also about the technical debt that they represent, because as more and more third-party code, open source code is used, how do you ensure that it's secure, and how do you go back and fix it all when it's not? I would say on the dependency side, first of all, you really should be scanning your dependencies. I've talked to many prospects in the market that are not scanning their dependencies. I think that's a huge risk. And I would recommend going a step further and allowing some of the scans to auto remediate those risks. So, for instance, when a vulnerable library is found and there's a more current library available, the tools can download that patch for you and apply the patch. So, use automation to your advantage wherever you can. We've provided, with GitLab, we've provided auto remediation for dependencies. We've also helped with providing a list of dependencies in the code to help you keep track of that. On the API side, APIs are going to be more and more prevalent, because as monolithic code is broken into smaller and smaller pieces, and open source and third-party code, it's those APIs that are the glue that hold it all together. And so if people haven't considered APIs within their security program, they definitely need to. And I would look towards the cloud providers to assist with that as well.
Wonderful. Sean, this turns my attention to the monolith itself and the breakup of the monolith, and what Cindy is talking about in terms of this proliferation of APIs that can, have tremendous value, but also have to be thought of in context of, the security risk and such. So I'm wondering, is this a concern you're hearing from customers? Is this something that you are recommending? Are you recommending any particular action?
Right. So actually, that's one of the areas we have some of the largest demand in terms of re-architecting applications and having API-based applications as well as microservices that are exposed. And also, as some of the cases, our clients are collaborating where they may be different state governments in terms of information exchange, and APIs actually need to be opened up. I think here I'd like to really say it's also a defense in depth strategy, right? Since Cindy mentioned what are the CSPs doing, or in our case, what do we advocate? One of them, for example, is if you're having APIs, consume something like API gateway on AWS. Now, in that case, you can actually have a web application firewall that is in front of your API gateway. That is obviously reducing the risk significantly, even if you have insecure APIs, right? And from an API perspective, the other thing we do is, of course, have because they change so frequently and there's so many of them, given what they're tied to, regular pen testing of this in terms of, are your APIs, I mean, how vulnerable are you to certain types of API injection attacks, or can your data actually be poisoned? Etc. So some of those things, and even enforcing basic checks like rate limitation, in case they aren't elsewhere. One of the other things, of course, that comes in parallel is authentication. And on AWS, as an example, you can actually use cognito-based authentication just for APIs, right? So there are some of those in terms of how the mechanisms we build around APIs itself to secure them. Going back to the developers that actually write a lot of these APIs, again, it's coming in with secure design principles to avoid or make sure that those kinds of flooding, injection, poisoning, etc. attacks don't actually impact.
Rohit, what would you add to this? Is there anything in particular that you believe is noteworthy to address? You must have lots of customers who are asking about these very questions themselves.
Yeah, if you think about the history of AWS, it actually got started as a set of services. I mean, that's what AWS stands for. And it was the original design was to have APIs for everything. So we fundamentally believe that APIs are the way to really do modern application development, and yet it is also the way that people use our systems. And so they're core to everything we do. And so protection of those and providing better visibility to how they are being used. I think the example that Sean gave about the WAF in front, yes, that's something that we see a lot of our customers doing today to actually verify that the access that is being made into the API is indeed valid and that there is no malicious activity happening there. Overall, yes, I definitely believe that our customers utilize most, if not all, of our APIs because that is really the core construct of the AWS platform.
Well, thank you. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to turn the attention to trends that you each are seeing in the DevSecOps space. And I'd like to ask if you could particularly keep in mind the research that you're following. According to articles that I've been reading, container technologies are becoming more of a focus of security research for, I expect, in many ways, what we've been discussing here. My question for you is, what is it that you're really keen on, and how are you sharing that with your customers as matters of importance? Cindy, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I did an enormous amount of research on this the second half of last year for a book that I wrote and that was intended to be for the CISO to understand the changes that are happening in development and how they need to prepare for that from a security standpoint. And there's a definite trend towards containers. Vast majority of folks are using containers at least some, in some areas, if not everywhere. The orchestrators and microservices, those things are becoming important, and cloud native is the flexibility of that is really becoming important. But I don't think that the security has all caught up in those areas. So there is some risk there, and it's not a matter of it's really a matter of the CISOs thinking through those new attack surfaces and those elements and incorporating that into their security program. That's where the biggest risk lies. So it really comes down to education, I think, and helping them understand. There's just too many CISOs. What the genesis for that book actually was walking around RSA year before last and listening to some of the questions, and people were asking, what is a container? Is it something physical that I can wrap my network security around? And or questions like that made me realize that there's a big opportunity, I think, to educate the security folks on the breadth of the program that they need to have. In terms of trends, you'd asked also, I think people are taking individual projects that tend to be a more innovative area or a less risky area and applying some of the DevSecOps principles to that and using it as sort of a proof of concept. And I see that trend continuing. And then generally what I see is they do it as a proof of concept, and then all of the other teams love the results and the outcome and say, hey, I want to do that too. And so it becomes kind of a self-propelling motion there.
Rohit, I'd love to hear your perspectives.
Yeah, I think starting with containers, we see a tremendous amount of adoption of container technology on AWS. In fact, the vast majority of container workloads that run in the cloud run on AWS. So we see a very, very large amount of deployment of containers in AWS. As far as sort of the research behind that, particularly for security, I think containers are a great operational construct. I don't think that containers really improves your security as much as people think. I think that security is still a problem for a lot of different deployments because of the way the application itself is architected or the way you've got security around it. So thinking of containers as sort of the silver bullet for improving your security is probably where people fall down a little bit. They don't really appreciate fully what containers do for them, and they give it more benefit than it actually deserves for security, at least. And so I think that people are coming around and realizing that, yes, there are some things that you get because of the encapsulation you get from containers and the ability to move workloads, but it's not as much around security, and that there is a special way to secure containers and really some more traditional approaches to security in general that apply even in the container space. So I think that is an area that people are still coming around to, and it's a trend where I see definitely moving in the right direction, but as Cindy said, there's an education element that still has to be done to really fully appreciate that. Beyond that, I think serverless is probably even further behind in terms of real understanding of the technology, and the security aspects of it are still very, very new. So there are a few approaches, and I think Sean mentioned some of the areas that they've looked at in the past, and that are up and coming in that area. However, that's still probably even further behind by at least 1 or 2 more years than container security is today.
Excellent. Sean, what would you add to that?
So I definitely agree with Rohit. I mean, just utilizing containers itself does not, for the purpose of security, would definitely agree that's not the case. We are seeing certain trends in terms of those that are moving to the cloud are more open to re-architecting applications. Of course, migrations of the last few years oftentimes were lift and shift. People are moving away from that, and now saying when we migrate to the cloud or we adopt cloud consumption, it's actually using containers. We're seeing a fair amount of serverless or functions as a service, but mostly containers. The fact that they realize that it's completely a different paradigm. You are deploying multiple times. Your focus is actually purely at the application level, also based on the execution role of the container and the type of container technology you adopt in the cloud, and what else you need to do, as opposed to firewalls, be it physical, be it virtual, etc. So there are those kinds of shifts in terms of what the focus is for security, where some of the spend is, how early that process is actually defined. a lot of organizations are trying to define what the ideal DevSecOps pipeline looks for them in terms of the tools they use for static and dynamic code analysis, what they use for container security, whether they use the cloud native repository and the capabilities that those bring, including security, or what are the security risks involved of deploying and maintaining a custom repository on the cloud? What additional security needs to be built around that you would otherwise have in an ECR or a GCR and GCP, so on and so forth. So those are some. Some of the research we've put out includes also developing solutions or proof of concept around, say, like containers often use so many different packages, or when people use base images, the developers aren't necessarily customizing them or stripping them down to the bare minimum. So one of the things, proof of concepts we had was something called debloat, where we showed that based on dependency mapping and requirements by the application or by the microservice you're building, once you strip out all of these other requirements that you don't need from a base Docker image, how many fewer vulnerabilities you potentially have, not just on that day, but of course, 15 days after it's deployed in production in case you didn't push a new version, simply because you just have a smaller attack surface. So those are also where Accenture's own research and Cyber Labs is pushing the boundary.
That's really helpful. Decreasing the attack surface, it reminds me of what I hear from developers about just making your code just thinner and thinner and thinner, and it applies to writing in our field as well. It's just being as clear and concise as you can. I would really like to thank all of you for joining us today. I've been joined by Rohit Gupta, Global Segment Leader Security at Amazon Web Services. Rohit, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Cindy Blake, Security Advocate at GitLab. Thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to talking with you more on security issues. I'd love to learn more about the book that you've written as well.
Great, thank you.
So thank you, Sean, for participating. Thanks for everyone for being here. I want to thank Palo Alto Networks for making this event possible. I'm Alex Williams of the New Stack. We'll be back again soon.